When I was taught the reign of Henry VIII a million years ago, in particular by Geoffrey Elton at Cambridge, there were several things, of course, where Geoffrey and I differed then and differ even more now. One of the things was, of course, in those days, insofar as the reign of Henry VIII had achievements, it was seen as the work of the minister rather than the king. As you will have seen, I've kept ministers very, very much in their place. My view is very definitely that the central figure is the king himself. Ministers, councillors, courtiers are immensely important. Wives are important, but the king himself is the primum mobile. He is the thing that moves, and above all, the thing that has to be moved. That doesn't mean those other people are not important, but that is simply not the focus that we're dealing with at the moment. And also, as part of that interpretation, for Geoffrey Elton, once the great minister, of course, for him, there was only one great minister, Thomas Cromwell, not Thomas Wolsey. Once Cromwell had fallen in 1540, the reign might as well have been over. And indeed, from Elton's point of view, the reign should have been over. And the last 6 or 7 years were a dreadful appendix of personal indulgence, unnecessary war, and general absurdity, showing what a superficial, trashy, and altogether royal person Henry was, and how much better government was when it was run by people like Geoffrey, who always confused himself with Thomas Cromwell. There we are. It will come as no surprise to you that I don't believe this. For me, and again, let me put my stall out right at the beginning, as I'm in the habit of doing with these lectures, it seems to me that it is the last years of the reign that witness the most extraordinary achievements. And that those achievements are directly and unquestionably, because at this point there is no minister, there is a council. And the council itself is an achievement of the king. They are undoubtedly the achievement of the king. But let's set the biographical context into place first. If you like, as we've been going through these lectures, we've been balancing two ideas, it seems to me. The first is the idea of a major shift in Henry's character from that, and of course there is very definitely in this one the element of retrospective and even valedictory, from that extraordinary young man, the musical, the gracious, the poetical, the charming, the loving, that we saw in that first lecture, through the great change that we saw towards the end of the last lecture, towards the figure who is here, who is the Henry of legend and the Henry of horror. So there is that kind of shift, focusing very definitely in the explanation that I've been giving you, not on the medicalization of the various accidents that Henry undergoes in 1530, particularly in 1536, is important. Vastly more important is the shift of, you like, also perhaps to trivialize, to tabloidize, to personalize, of a very bad divorce, the extraordinary consequences of the divorce itself, which is the rupture, remember, in everything. It's the rupture in Henry's own life. One of the things that I've been insisting, and I think this exhibition brings out beautifully, is looking at just how conventional the young Henry is when you look at the things that are there, when you look at things like the Ushaw roll, the most representative, typical, Duffy-esque form of late medieval religion, and then the dramatic change, first with the arguments about the divorce and papal authority, and then the broad-based attack on so much of the apparatus of medieval piety, which Henry had been once the most devoted follower of. That's one sort of rupture. Another kind of rupture is the rupture in the king's own personal circle, the shift from that man who had been so close to his first wife that he proclaims in one of the poems that we have on display in the King Henry VIII songbook, that he married for love. The daughter that he'd loved so passionately Mary, that he rejects. Thomas More, the friend to whom he'd been so close for so long, that he rejects and beheads, and so on. I mean, this rupture in family, this rupture in friends, this rupture in ideas, this rupture in religion, this rupture in politics. And if you put all those together and look at them, in some ways the divorce is long. I mean, 33, of course, is the moment of the Boleyn marriage and so on. In some ways, it's a long time. From 1527, that the letter on loan from the Vatican, in which, in very early January 1527, Henry and Anne pledged their love, to the actual realization of that love in matrimony. But I think they get married twice, just to make absolutely sure. Once when they come back from France in October-November 1532, and then again a rather extraordinary ceremony in January that's designed, like so many of the events of early 1533, to pretend that the Pope was on side in this extraordinary series of revolutionary events. But although it's, in one sense, it's a long time, in another, if you actually look at what happens from a world in which England is part of, an absolutely central part, it's impossible to think of England as not being part of the main, not part of continental Europe, not part of Catholic Christendom, to an England in which people have suddenly started to think we are different, we are separate. The Channel is wide. They do things differently there. We do things differently here. 6 years is a tiny period of time. I mean, this is a revolution, in England on the scale of the French or the Russian. I mean, as always, we get our revolutions over early. We grow out of them. Which is why we're in our sort of rather, I think, fag-endy condition that we are at the moment. We seem to me to have outgrown most forms of political activity, indeed, arguably, in this weather, any form of activity at all. But I think it's amazing that you've come here, presumably because it's air-conditioned and dark and you can sleep. But there we are. So this is the measure of the change. But it's not simply, and this is the point that I shall be arguing, it's not simply that it's a product of this internal torment and this, as it were, these internal fissures. It also leads to the achievement, it leads to the extraordinary importance of the reign. And indeed, it is the paradox that on the one hand, it is the decline of character, on the other, the ascent of achievement. Now, going alongside this personal change, there is, of course, the other issue, the issue of the pursuit of greatness. If you remember, going right back to the beginning and quoting from Mountjoy's letter to Erasmus, I argued that Henry is conscious, and indeed, arguably, it is the one streak of real consistency in him. It is the pursuit of fame. It is the determination to be famous, to be remembered. And that what changes, of course, is the method, again, the conventionality, war, rather less conventional, peace, but of course, peace with honour, peace with glory, and then, as it were, completely unexpectedly, completely left field, greatness in what, interestingly enough, in the 16th century order of hierarchy of importance, greatness as religious reformer, which like Malvolio in Twelfth Night, was a condition that was thrust upon him. It was a form of greatness that was thrust upon him that he had no choice about, but nevertheless that he manipulates, that he handles magnificently. I mean, it seems to me that Henry isn't a great strategist, but by heavens, is he a most brilliant tactician. At every stage, he handles, it seems to me, politics and men with quite brilliant tactical skill. So we've then got that broad pattern. Let's now look at the ups and the downs of this last phase of the reign. The first thing I think that's striking, of course, is the oddity from this point onwards, which I've been mentioning before, of the king's personal life. The Boleyn marriage, of course, made at such enormous cost, and yet lasting for such a short period of time. How are we to understand it? The first 3 years of this period, of course, the 1,000 days, corresponding to the Boleyn marriage. Clearly, I think there are two elements to it. The first is the self-evident fact that Anne only produces a daughter, if we can refer to Elizabeth the Great as with an only in front of her. She only produces a daughter. But the second, I think, again, is and it's a testimony to this remarkable coarsening in Henry's character, which I think to a very significant extent, is actually brought about by Anne herself. I think there's no doubt whatever, in that 6 years after January 1527, in many ways, the key driving force behind Henry is Anne. The evidence, again, which the exhibition shows very clearly, is that Anne herself is primarily the religious experimenter, much more than Henry. There's much more evidence of Anne being in contact with new religious ideas, absorbing reformed ideas. Not I think, in any very extravagant fashion, but in many ways, relatively official stuff from France and the French court, and the court particularly of Francis I's favourite sister, Marguerite of Angoulême. There are much more radical influences coming in through Anne's brother, through George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. And again, there are fascinating collections of books there that rather bizarrely, after the fall of the Boleyns, were absorbed into the Royal Library, and we've therefore been able to make use of. Now, Henry, of course, is very experimental at this point when it comes to things about the government of the church, about the claim to royal authority over the church, the argument that it goes back to the deepest myths of time, to a point when England didn't exist, to the Old Testament, and so on. But as it were, the religious encounters are much more Anne. I think also it is possible to say, and again this depends on very particular readings of the dispatches of the Imperial Ambassador Chapuis, it looks to me as though it is Anne who eggs Henry on. Anne is harder. Henry is learning to be hard at this point. Particularly, I think, the rupture with his daughter and his wife, Henry, to begin with, handles them with a certain discretion, evident regret, caution, a certain fear, particularly of Catherine of Aragon, who was a formidable opponent. But Anne has, for obvious reasons, her only chance of justifying everything that she'd done, of not finishing up on the scrap heap or worse, was actually to get that wedding through. To get that wedding through, she had to toughen Henry. She had to put backbone. She had to put teeth. She had to put, if you'll forgive the phrase, spunk into him. And she does it clearly, I think, very effectively. And I think here again, I draw strength from the fact that Eric Ives, I always say, it's a brilliant book. It's so good that he wrote it twice. The second version of it, I think, really very much picks these issues up. So she's stiffening him and coarsening him and making him harsher. But of course, she herself becomes the first victim, because it seems to me that the best way of characterizing their relationship is that she was a most brilliant mistress. That a woman who is a mistress, particularly a mistress who wants to become a wife, has to be perpetually demanding if only to become a wife. And Anne shows genius at this. The trouble is, she continues to behave like that once she becomes wife and queen. And that simply is unacceptable. In other words, everything that attracts us to Anne, remember, was regarded as singular, bizarre, odd, dangerous, even witch-like, completely unfemale, completely unfeminine in her own time. It's one of the reasons, not simply that she is the Camilla, in the relationship with, and again, the extraordinary, especially amongst women, unpopularity of Camilla in the early stages of it is very, very typical to what the reaction to Anne was. But it's not simply that. It's that she is perceived as being unwomanly. That what we find attractive in this feminist, post-feminist age about her was repugnant to her own time. But it had, obviously, the consequences of the hardening and harshening of Henry. And again, it's a very striking illustration of why the medicalized accounts of the accidents in January 1536 really don't get us very far. After all, the appalling treatment treatment of Catherine in the latter stages, the brutal act of the separation of mother and daughter, the execution of Moore and Fisher, all of these are before this supposed medical revolution in Henry. Admittedly, the act of the most infinite brutality, namely the execution of Anne herself on the trumped-up charges of multiple adultery, and in some ways what I think is an even more unpleasant process, the grinding of poor Mary's nose into the dust in the course of the summer of 1536, in one of the most horrible exercises of paternal power over a child that I know of in the 16th century, and done with a kind of refined deliberation of cruelty which utterly breaks Mary. And of course, leads with Mary, I think, to something that has been completely misunderstood. Mary is not the centre of Catholic reaction, is not some kind of Catholic alternative after 1536. From 1536 to her father's death, Mary is a completely straightforward Henrician. She dare not, could not, and I think would not. She is broken. In the summer of 1536, she is simply broken. There is no evidence of any continuing contact with Catholic reaction. There's no evidence of any contact with papal messengers or Cardinal Poole or anything of this kind of thing. Mary, as it were, the Catholic reactionary, Mary, the self-conscious heroine of a revived Roman Catholicism, is entirely a product of Edward's reign. The brutal Henry of 1536 smashes her completely. And the Mary, remember, of the latter part of Henry's reign is so much part of the Henrician establishment that, for example, she works with her last stepmother, Catherine Parr, to translate some of the works of Erasmus. She's completely part of the, as I said, there is no sense of her as any kind of source of dissent, any kind of, as it were, alternative to Henry, which is one of the reasons, I think, why Henry's eventual settlement of the succession looks less strange at the time than it comes to later on, because of the very extent to which it would appear that Mary, like Elizabeth voluntarily always presents herself as her father's daughter. Mary, in fact, was forced into that role in 1536. So, now the execution of Anne, and again, there's not time to go into it. The detail is so complex. If we get into that realm, we'll be here all night, and that will take us back into the business of wives rather than Henry himself. But what, of course, is very striking about it is that in exactly the same way, Henry decides finally to get rid of Catherine the moment he has fallen in love with Anne. Well, it's exactly the same with Anne and Jane Seymour. The decision to get rid of Anne only follows an effective agreement to marry by Henry and Jane. In other words, one is lined up before the other one is got rid of. It's also very important, I think, when we look at Jane herself and how far she is complicit. I mean, again, you look in the exhibition, Jane goes out of her way to present herself as being the opposite of Anne. Anne, the stridency, Anne, the assertion, Anne, the boastfulness, groin que groin, and ainsi sera, groin que groin, is going to be, complain who will, Anne the most happy, all this strident sort of stuff. Jane, on the other hand, goes for traditional, she stoops to conquer femininity, bound to obey and serve as her motto, as it appears on the wonderful Holbein design for the Seymour Cup. It was regarded as being a little OTT, even in the early 16th century. But of course, it is she stoops to conquer. It is another method by which a woman can play the king, and she plays it extraordinarily effectively. It's also quite clear that Jane goes out of her way to present herself as being the opposite in religion to Anne. Anne, experimental, Jane, consciously conservative. Jane consciously enjoying good relations with Mary, even when it's rather dangerous, at the point when Henry is determined to break Mary and to show that she will be reconciled to him on his terms, not on her terms. And Jane again lets out certain sort of hints that she would have preferred a more conservative religious settlement, rather more of monasticism and whatever that Henry is interested in. And she herself finds herself the victim of Henry's increasingly rough tongue, an increasingly absolute sense that only he knew the way. This exquisitely balanced way between, as it were, Catholic and Protestant, that is perceivable only by the king because of his direct divine inspiration. In other words, I think when we look again at this extraordinary what on earth does he think he's doing issue, I think we've got to stop sort of seeing the natural outcome of the Reformation as being either Reformation or counter-Reformation, Catholic or Protestant. I don't think that gets to what Henry thought he was doing at all. For Henry, on the contrary, what is central to the Reformation is what he did. It is the royal supremacy. And this is where I think that we've got not simply the reign of Henry wrong, I think we've got the whole period from the middle of the 16th to the end of the 17th century wrong. The fundamental issue probably becomes for more and more of the king's subjects, as if you like, religious sensitivities, ideas of sectarian difference, what we could loosely refer to as the Northern Islandization of British religion, as that becomes clearer and clearer. Being Catholic or being Protestant becomes more and more important. From the king's perspective, from the monarch's perspective, particularly from Henry's perspective, it is the fact that you are supreme head of the church. And this seems to me what Henry regarded as being important. And if one looks at the religious texts and images and combinations of text and image, and remember one of the key things that we see in this exhibition is the extraordinary importance of the combination of word and image. I mean, it's been one of the great problems with the Tudor period because of what you could describe as the court-old view of art. That's to say, it's something different from and arguably superior to the written word, and it demands interpretation by extraordinary levels of connoisseurship, scholarship, and all the rest of it. It ignores the fact that most important images of the Tudor period tell you explicitly what they are and what they are about because they incorporate text, and that arguably the text is more important than the image, and the text actually shapes the image. And if you look throughout, you will see, look at the remarkable picture, which dates, of course, to the year following. What is Jane's greatest achievement? Well, of course, it's the birth of Edward, which is the son, which is represented by the magnificent Holbein portrait of him as an infant. But look at it. The verses are actually incorporated into the picture. And interestingly enough, whereas the name of the artist does not appear, who is a mere craftsman, the author of the verses, Richard Morrison, does. And the verses tell you what the picture is supposed to do. It's to be seen in direct relationship with Holbein's great portrait of Henry and Edward's mother and Henry's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, which itself, too, centres on a great panel of verse, almost certainly also written by Richard Morrison. And the little Edward is to be the heir of his father, and his measure of his greatness will be whether he can match Henry's greatness. And the verses on the in the Privy Chamber painting, the great dynastic painting of Henry, Jane Seymour, Henry VII, and Elizabeth of York, tell you what that achievement is. They say, his father is great. The whole thing, as I've said before, is a kind of Frank Sinatra in Latin, who is the greatest, and Henry conceding that his father is great because he'd suppressed civil war, but claiming again this issue of greatness and religion and reform, that he is greater because whilst he wielded the sceptre, the power of popes was trodden underfoot and true religion was restored in England. And this is what this is one of the key images for understanding the late Henry. It is his sense that that the royal supremacy is not, again, as I was taught by Elton, and we were all taught, is not simply a jurisdictional fact. It's not simply a convenience to enable Henry to get a divorce. In which case, why, when he's got a marriage with Jane Seymour that is legitimate by the laws of Canterbury and Rome, when he's got an heir, it doesn't matter that he's murdered a woman to get there, that's neither here nor there. It's a legitimate marriage. Why is it a legitimate marriage when he's got a son who is legitimate and is heir by the laws of Rome as well as Canterbury? Why doesn't he go back to Rome if the supremacy was simply a jurisdictional device? And indeed, a great many people in 1536, very, very clever people like Stephen Gardiner, thought that is what was probably going to happen. And we have a very remarkable account by Gardiner. Again, one of the great problems is that historians, and it's particularly bedevils modern A-level and university courses, but it also bedevils what historians do. They tend to treat such sort of pilules of time, little bits of time. Remember, Gardiner lives right into the reign of Mary. And at the moment of the reconciliation with Rome in late 1533, on St. Andrew's Day, 1533, the first main speech, of course, is given by Cardinal Pole, by Reginald Pole, but the second great sermon, actually it's a far, far superior piece of literature, is given by Stephen Gardiner himself on the theme of "Now is the hour." And he goes right back into Henry's reign. How nearly we went back to Rome, but we didn't. And the first of them is 1536. He remembers how near they were, how possible it would have been. And the reason you don't go back, and my own collateral ancestor, Thomas Starkey, nearly loses his head for betting on it and getting much too close into bed with Poole, who was his old friend, as a result of that bet. Why doesn't Henry do it? He doesn't do it because, as everything most closely and personally intimate, closely and personally intimately involved with Henry, these word-image things, demonstrates in the last 10 years of his life, Henry persuades himself that the royal supremacy is divinely endowed and is the central aspect of his kingship. And it is the great motivation of the man. I mean, I think it's impossible to exaggerate how completely Henry believes this. To us, it sounds like delusion, madness. Henry, I think, believes he's just less than God. Just less. And the evidence is fascinating. When, in the bishop's book, and Henry comes, as it were, to correct the theological drafting of his bishops, there is one quite extraordinary section where the king's pen, have you noticed, we're talking now about Henry, have you noticed how much more of Henry's handwriting you see the further you go on into the exhibition? The beginning, there are just little bits, and then it starts to get a rather lot, and then it becomes absolutely omnipresent on every document that you're looking at. Well, unfortunately, this particular document is one of those that got away, so it's actually in Bodley rather than where it should be here. But nevertheless, it is a truly extraordinary document, because Henry's pen is not content with altering what Cranmer had said or Tunstall has said. It looks at the text of the Ten Commandments and finds them inadequately drafted. And it goes through, in detail, Thou shalt not kill. But come on, we've got war, the public executions. I mean, these blanket injunctions, just it's a bit like the Human Rights Act. Nothing as boring as the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Oh no, it must be subject to this, that, and the other. Until finally, poor old Archbishop Cranmer has got to explain that it is a central assumption of both Christianity and Judaism that the Ten Commandments are the direct word of God, and that not even Henry probably should really tamper with them. But and the fact that I'm not just playing with ideas, again, there are two other key word-image combinations in the exhibition, both of which we know, one of them was literally held by Henry in his hands, the other is very close to him. The text of the Great Bible, which is first published in 1539, but the most important versions of it are in 1540. This is the first official version of the whole Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament, in English, with a magnificent title page. And if you look at the version of the title page that we show here, it's splendidly coloured. It's probably one of those that was actually owned by Henry himself. And if you look at it, you see, of course, this is the Bible. This is the Word of God, verbum Dei. And of course, God appears on the title page. But you've never seen such a tiny, polite little deity. I mean, he's right at the top, sort of, deferentially popping out of a cloud, and looking with appropriate reverence at Henry, who sits enthroned in the middle, taking up a third of the entire title page. And what's much more to the point, the Bible is given only to Henry. God speaks only to Henry. The verbum Dei goes to Henry, and then it's Henry, this is quite extraordinary thought, who actually passes it on to the bishops. Henry is and incidentally to his lay councillors, Henry is the mediator between God and man. This is what the royal supremacy, in its full-blown sense, meant. And it becomes genuine royal religion. It's a real English Shinto. And I, again, okay, title page of the Great Bible, public statement, fine for the common folk. But I think perhaps the most interesting test case of all of this is the King's Psalter, the Jean Mallard Psalter, written for Henry. It's Henry's personal use, gone through him minutely, covered again in his own handwriting, using the sort of soft red crayon that he does at the most intimate moments. So he's not just flicked through this thing, he's really read it carefully. These are them, and the British Library is actually publishing a very, very splendid facsimile of it at the moment with the Folio Society, plug. So the king has gone through it, and you can see he's reacting emotionally to these things. I mean, particularly experiences some of his later marriages, especially the dreadful rebound from Anne of Cleves to Catherine Howard and the fate of Catherine Howard, all are reflected there. But Mallard's illustrations are completely extraordinary. Most of the Psalms, or as you know, the key passages in the Psalms, which are the Psalms of David, who was, of course, a king, who was a musician and a poet, and was one of the type cases of kingship, which is used to argue the proper relationship of king and church and the royal supremacy. But David is also the ancestor of Christ. Christ comes from the house of David. And also, in standard medieval theology and theodicy, is seen as prefiguring Christ in particular key examples of the Psalms. And in these key examples of the Psalms, which, David prefigures Christ, who is represented in Henry's Psalter as being David? Henry. Even down in the penitential Psalms, to Henry David in agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right? Henry as David, combating the papist Goliath, and so on. I mean, we read through these things, I think, particularly through the Psalter, which is so intimate. And there is that marvellous illustration in which you see the whole thing with mirror after mirror after mirror. And you see Henry sitting reading in his chamber what is obviously the Psalter. And so this is an image of the king reading the book in which the image is contained. And it's the mirrors going, the parallel mirrors going into Henry's mind, I think really take us into the heart of the man. This, I suppose, is the other side of the brutality, the cruelty, the raising and falling of ministers, wives, and so on, and the apparent, the extraordinary enforcement of religious conformity, the most famous symbol of which is the hanging, drawing, and quartering of 3 Catholics and traitors, and the burning of 3 Protestants as heretics on the same day. Just to show there are no hard feelings, just to show there's an absolute impartiality of terror. I mean, to us, if you see what I mean, if you see religion as being about a struggle between confessions, it's an absurdity. If you see it, on the other hand, as Henry's own self-perception of what God wants him to do, and of what kind of line is peculiarly revealed to him, then I think it all starts to make sense. And it makes sense with these texts. And also I think it was how Henry himself came to make sense of the shattering changes in his own life. These are the result of direct divine inspiration. I think it's the only way that you can cope with such transformations. At a time, remember, when there were not a few people who were telling him what Henry had done in any traditional Catholic perspective, and of course his cousin, Reginald Poole, tells him effectively to his face, merits hellfire. Several times over. As indeed, papal excommunication and deprivation and so on very strongly suggest. So this, I think, is how Henry came to cope with it. That it was the belief in a direct divine inspiration, in his occupation of a unique role that conferred an absolute and undeniable and unchallengeable authority on him. And again, you can see this very clearly in all sorts of theological arguments that Henry finds himself engaged in. For example, there's all this conventional nonsense that Henry is really Catholic right up to the end. It is nonsense. Henry does not believe in priesthood. There is only one order ordained of God, and 3 guesses what that is. That's kings. Priests are merely a human device. And this is where I think someone like Cranmer, Cranmer is the great theologian of this English Shinto. Cranmer is the great theologian of this royal power over the church. And, brilliant though Diarmaid MacCulloch's biography of Cranmer is, I don't think it quite grasps this point. And that he is so interested in what Cranmer becomes when Cranmer starts to develop the fully Protestant theologies, which he does under Edward, that his real importance under Henry, and why Henry is so committed to him and allows him to go off in all these bizarre directions. The famous exchange between Henry and Cranmer, when effectively he's being accused of heresy in Kent, and there's a great campaign against heresy in Kent, and Henry, in his usual jovial fashion, settles down with Cranmer in the royal barge, sort of lying back there, and Cranmer. And Henry says to Cranmer, I know who's the greatest heretic in Kent. He says, you. Can you imagine that moment? And yet it's tolerated. And I think it's because he knows it's Cranmer who really invents this stuff. Cranmer, with the Collectania, Cranmer's work back in 1530, and Cranmer is always its most effective propagandist and its true believer, which is why, of course, for Paul Cranmer, although he embarks on this great voyage of Protestant discovery, for him, again going forward to Mary, because the truth of so much of what happens under Henry only becomes clear then, why for Cranmer the supreme torment is when the supreme head of the church turns out to be a Catholic with Mary. That's why Cranmer, I think, very nearly converts. much more than the theological arguments that are presented to him by his Roman inquisitors and persecutors. It's because, of course, he knows that the vehicle of God's purpose on earth is the monarch, and that the national church is the true church. And I think that's what captures him. Now, this extraordinary process of Henry's absorption into the deity, Henry's assumption of quasi-divine characteristics and so on, I think is again part of, obviously, the achievement. I mean, the great achievement of the reign, the supreme achievement of the reign is and has to be the royal supremacy. That is what shapes English politics right through to the Glorious Revolution. Remember, every future monarch of England does what Henry had done. Changes religion. Edward one direction, Mary another, Elizabeth an exquisite balancing act, Charles quasi-Roman, Oliver Cromwell, who was of king, of course, towards freebooting congregations. Charles II, well, certainly back to mainstream Anglicanism, but with as Catholic a flavour as he dared to get away with. James II, fully back to Rome. Then, of course, the whole thing stops, except it doesn't, because William and Mary are the first really reformed monarchs to sit on the English throne, apart from Edward. The only monarch who doesn't change religion is James I, who so adores the royal supremacy that he wants to impose it in Scotland. So he tries to change the religion of Scotland, which is equally catastrophic. You see what I mean? This is the Henry legacy. It's one of quite extraordinary impact. But, of course, it has other huge consequences. And again, in order to grasp the scale of Henry's achievement towards the end of the reign, I think we've got to begin with grasping the magnitude of the royal supremacy, the magnitude of the rupture that it represents. If we put back this idea of a royal revolution, the phrase of George Bernard, the King's Reformation, which I think has to be absolutely right, and a reformation that puts the king at the centre of religion, then, of course, that reformation has got to be protected, like the king himself. And again, because I think that we've failed to register just what its magnitude is, we don't look at quite what has to be done to protect it, or who does the protecting. I think the first thing that we need to remember is that the scale of this revolution does change government. I remember vigorously debating all those years ago, when I was one of Elton's students, was there this thing called the revolution in government, a Tudor revolution in government, with all of these funny words like bureaucracy and whatever, which I've always pointed out to students, never use because you can't spell it. That is increasingly true, it has to be said. In the sense that Elton meant it, i.e. a government that is, as it were, a shift away from charismatic government towards government by committee and so on, it is manifestly nonsensical. Henry VIII, beyond any doubt, is the most charismatic of English monarchs. And, of course, the impact of the royal supremacy is not, as we're constantly told, to secularize the church. It is to sacralize the monarchy and the state. And remember, one of the ways in which that happens, and it's going right back to my own early work on court ceremony, what happens is, of course, that royal ceremony, which, remember, all English court ceremony before the Reformation is religious. Almost all. All the great feast days of court are the great feast days of church. The highlight moments of them are the monarch's particular participation in the rituals of the chapel royal. Fine. Now, things like the feast of the Epiphany, where the monarch enacts the rituals of presenting the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The candle mass, where the monarch presents a special candle to Mary on the feast of the Virgin and so on, the feast of the Annunciation. The Maundy, in which the monarch enacts the role of Christ on the Thursday before Good Friday. We can go on and on and on and on. Ladies and gentlemen, all of these rituals, with the exception of the Marian Candlemas, continue. Despite, as it were, Protestantization, even under Elizabeth, even with Elizabeth, when you've got very seriously Protestant First Minister, William Cecil, all of these things are kept. In other words, the rituals that were once perfectly normal, because every other great head of household, every other great nobleman did them, all of these are abolished everywhere else because they're superstitious and Catholic, apart from when they elevate the monarch. So the monarch finds him or herself literally elevated to an absolutely unique relationship with God, in which royal sacredness allows whole forms of symbolism and ritual which elsewhere are expelled because they're papist, but survive because they're associated with the monarch. So the sacralization of the state. But of course, doing this obviously means that there's no revolution in the government in the sense of getting rid of or diminishing monarchy. On the contrary, the most monarchical age in English history is the one that follows the royal supremacy, right? The monarch literally sort of making and unmaking religion practically at will and at the beginning of each reign. But what does change, and here again, I think that Geoffrey was both very right and very wrong. The nature of the English government does change. Before the Reformation, the essential purpose of policy was occasional. It was war, which happens from time to time. And for much of the rest of the time, domestic government effectively goes to sleep. For very long, it's when everybody witters on about wanting full-time MPs, ladies and gentlemen, I would insist that they had 30 or 40 jobs. The one thing they must not do is legislate. Damnably dangerous. Keep them busy, let them run the city, let them fiddle local government if they're Labour. Whatever it is, just keep their hands off legislation, as was the blissful state before the Reformation. Come the Reformation, the essential nature of government policy changes. The central aspect of government policy now becomes the enforcement of conformity at home rather than foreign policy abroad. And indeed, foreign policy in many ways becomes an accident of that. It's especially clear under Elizabeth. Now, this transforms the nature of government. If government is essentially foreign policy and war, government can be occasional. If you look at meetings of the late medieval council, it's from time to time. It's normally concentrated in term time. In other words, roughly when the universities, nowadays universities actually condescend to do a little bit of teaching. You remember my own University of Cambridge, you were lucky if you were taught for 24 weeks a year. I think it's too much, but I mean, serious risk of overtaxing the mind if you do it properly. But anyway, that was roughly how government worked. With the Reformation, it changes. And it changes, and you can put a date on it. It's the week after Cromwell's fall. With the week after Cromwell's fall, Henry takes government by the scruff of the neck. He sets up the fully operational Privy Council. He chooses its clerk, and it now is, government is 24, 24, 7, 7, 12, 12. All of these dreadful Americans. The Privy Council now meets virtually every day, in vacation as well as term time, and people are expected to attend. There's none of this business of councillors just wandering off. And who is responsible for it? Only one man could have been, only one man is, it is Henry. And you see, and the British Library has got, needless to say, all the documents here, and you can see Henry writing to leading ministers, Audley, the Lord Chancellor, the Duke of Suffolk, his brother-in-law, who had not done a day's work in his entire life. Suddenly, oh, I'm going off for the vacation. Henry, no, you're not. No, I haven't been home for weeks, neglected the garden, the wife's demanding to see me. Henry, stay. Only a king could do that. And it seems to me that in that sense, in the last 7 years of the reign, you have a genuine new sort of government, which is required to manage primarily domestic policy. Because suddenly, remember, with the Reformation, things that had been of no importance to anybody, like what did some poor woman in Kendal, where I was born, think about religion? Nobody had given a damn about Kendal in its entire history, unless it had been fought over as a land holding. But suddenly it matters. If you're trying to enforce religious conformity, the opinions in the localities, wherever they are, matter. The only way you can keep tabs on that is by this immensely elaborate, perpetually churning machine. And only a king could have brought about that change. And Henry does it in complex ways, which I have discussed elsewhere, with a combination of stick and carrot. He says, again, he involves the high nobility in this process, and he says to them, basically, if you come and be a regular member of my council and hold state offices, then I will give you what you most covet, which is promotion in the peerage and outranking your peers. Because remember, this is an aristocratic society in which precedence and order are the things that most matter and are most valued. And Henry says, involve yourself in my government, work as you've never worked before, and you will get that reward. And all kinds of peers who've been backwoods peers, like the Earls of Arundel, who've kept out of politics since the end of the Wars of Roses, suddenly pile back, because otherwise there's no point in being Premier Earl if suddenly some junior Earl who happens to hold the position of Earl, Lord Admiral or Lord Chamberlain or what have you, marches in the House of Lords ahead of you. No, so you've got to involve yourself too. That's Henry. And of course, again, it's the sheer magnitude of the change at home in terms of religion that accounts for an awful lot of foreign policy too. England is at grave risk, and with the treaties of Nice and all the rest of it in 1539, looks as though it's going to achieve the status of European pariah. It is the schismatic state. Henry is in a sense, the Antichrist. And the risk of this, of course, is of a broad-based European attack on England, the sort of thing that had been simply unintelligible under the old politics. And I think so much of what happens the extraordinary, and Peter, of course, is the map librarian, as he said in his own work, has focused on this, and the magnificent maps that we display in the exhibition are a testament to this. There is this threat of a broad European attack by both the Habsburgs and the Valois, France and Spain and the Empire and the Netherlands against England. And what this does is to lead to both enormous material consequences, that is to say, an amazing campaign in which you map the whole of the coastline of England, right from the northeast, from Hull, the whole of the way down, the Wash, East Anglia, the Thames, the Blackwater, round the north of the Forelands and whatever, the Downs, along the English Channel coast, the Isle of Wight, wonderful maps of the southwest, Bristol Channel, and right up to Milford Haven and whatever. And then you fortify. Where you map, you fortify. You, in other words, see... I already made this business of... I made this point about tactics and strategy. Henry, in this sense, is genuinely strategic. I think he is the first person genuinely to see England as a single strategic problem. That is to say, how do you make an island defensible? Because we're so embedded in our slovenly minds that England was never conquered from abroad after 1066. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the most unmitigated tripe. Every single change of king in the Middle Ages is the result of a foreign invasion, culminating in the Tudors in 1485, in which England is taken by 2,500 French troops and 2,500 and 20 little ships. It's a foreign invasion. And it's Henry who actually turns England into a moated, defensible island, with the combination of the mapping, the sighting of these amazing forts, which he himself also designs, the huge number of cannon for whose manufacture he himself is directly responsible, and combining that, of course, with a totally reinvented Royal Navy, which again only happens at the end of the reign. All these great changes are concentrated in the last 7 years as the full consequences of the royal supremacy become absolutely clear and unmitigatable. the great changes in the Royal Navy, remember, are on, again, an enormous scale. Right up to the beginning of Henry's reign, the essential navy does not exist. It is simply a kind of territorial army, territorial navy drawn from the cinque ports, the little ports and the fishing ports scattered around Kent and East Sussex. That is perfectly adequate if the purpose of the navy is to occasionally scour the seas to get rid of pirates and to sometimes ferry royal armies across the Channel. It is absolutely useless if you're wanting to use the navy as the outer wall of defence for the whole of the English coastline. And also, again, if you've transformed ships in exactly the same way that Henry had transformed forts, from decorative objects with the occasional cannon in them to huge vessels capable of firing broadsides, which, of course, and with the Mary Rose, you can actually see the process by which an old type of ship is altered into a new style of ship capable of delivering the broadside. But such ships are big, because they've got so many cannon in them, they draw a lot of water, which means the little ports of Kent and Sussex are absolutely no use for them. You have to have deep water ports. That means you need things like dry docks. That means that you need far fewer ports, but much more sophisticated levels of administration. It also means that you've got ships that are absolutely useless for any other purpose than warships, so the king has got to maintain them. And so the invention of the navy, which happens at the very end of Henry's reign, is also a central part of this process. But what I would argue is the most important thing, going quite beyond all this, is that finally Henry really is, and it's a devastating claim, but I'm going to make it, Henry invents England. That is not simply he's the first Eurosceptic. The whole argument that I've been giving you puts him very firmly into that category. It is, I think, that the extraordinary force of the revolution. I mean, revolutions, and what goes on with the English Reformation under Henry is a royal revolution. It's not simply a royal reformation; it is a royal revolution. And these things have, although they're horrible and hundreds suffer, and the exhibition is quite unsparing about this. It lists the victims at the end quite correctly. There's no point in pretending otherwise, and it would be wrong to do so. But, ladies and gentlemen, revolutions also have energy. They bring about vast transformations, mental transformations. Modern France, of course, so much of modern France is the creation of that handful of years from 1789 to the Terror, and then with a rather dreadful appendix under Napoleon, from which we're all suffering with the EU, which is a completely Napoleonic invention, totally Napoleonic in concept and execution. But with Henry, it is this idea of an England which, of course, is sanctified because it's a church as well as a nation. And it involves not simply religion, it involves not simply politics, it not simply involves the sense of England as being separate and distinct, with its own separate and distinct history. It's also to do with language. The very idea of English as a language transforms itself under Henry. It is quite right that we have a major sections in the exhibition devoted to the two greatest poets of the reign, apart from Henry himself, Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, because it is under Henry, not under Elizabeth, that the great art forms of the sonnet and blank verse are invented. And obviously the Elizabethans perfect them. The invention happens under Henry. And it's also under Henry, and again, we have the text in the exhibition, that you, as it were, invent a history of English to correspond to the political history of England, which is also reinvented to make the king's claim to the supreme head of the church historically legitimated, with the preface written in 1532 to the first official complete works of Chaucer, which itself is an official publication. Can you imagine? a poetical text. Only in Scotland does that sort of thing happen with Robert Burns, nowadays. But it's with Chaucer. Chaucer is invented as the national poet, as the repository of England and Englishness and good English and whatever. The claims for him in that preface of 1532, look at it, 1532, on the very eve of these vast changes, are that English is a great language, Chaucer is his greatest poet, and that Chaucer is the English Homer and he is the English Virgil. And the implication is, of course, and Henry is the English Augustus. And Henry is the English Augustus, or the English Louis XIV. Probably he's nearer to Louis XIV. It's no accident that it's only 100 years after Louis XIV that France collapses into revolution. I think it's no accident, again, that less than 100 years after Henry's death, well, in fact, it's 102 years after Henry's death, that Charles walks to the scaffold through the great palace that Henry had made the centre of English government. He had created a structure. He created a structure of such extraordinary power and that had such impact on the lives of his subjects that only a king of his capacity or his daughters could actually manage it. And lesser breeds without the law from the north, beyond the English frontier, simply couldn't cope. They could not stand. The Stuarts could not stand in Henry's shoes.